Welcome to another episode of On the History Trail. I'm your host and tour guide, Mark Nonesteid. On today's episode, we are going to discuss collecting art pottery with David Rago. Mr. Rago runs Rago Auctions and Art Center in Lambertville, New Jersey. He is also a regular appraiser on the PBS series Antiques Roadshow. We're going to learn about the history of art pottery, where it was produced, collecting tips, and New Jersey's role in the production of art pottery. So sit back and relax and follow me as we travel on the History Trail. Well, David, welcome to the show. First, let's talk about art pottery. Let's define art pottery.
Well, you get a different definition depending who you talk to, but for me, technically, it's American ceramics made for decorative rather than utilitarian purposes.
Okay.
From about 1875 until about World War I.
Okay, and if we take a step back and we look at art pottery, is it part of the larger arts and crafts movement from that time period?
It is and it isn't. A certain part of it is very much part of the arts and crafts movement and defines what the arts and crafts movement is in America, but such as George Orr, for example. I brought two pieces of George Orr here today, and then other things like the Rookwood pottery maybe began early on as part of the arts and crafts movement, China painting and how that influenced arts and crafts, but then it became a more commercial pursuit.
Okay, so then later on it becomes more of a mass-produced item where maybe earlier it's more one of a kind or there's more of an artist hand in the production?
Again, the definitions vary. Right? Technically, a piece of arts and crafts pottery like George Orr, these two pieces in the front here, George Orr dug the mud from the Chautauqua River and wheelbarrowed it to his pottery, which he built himself brick by brick, and he built his kiln, and he chopped the wood for the kiln, and every piece of George Orr is a manifestation of his spirit, 100% George Orr, as opposed to Rookwood, which is a beautiful and famous American pottery, but that was a huge factory with hundreds of employees, and people designed the vases and decorated and made the glazes and worked the kilns, and perhaps 20 people were involved in the production of this piece. And ideally, arts and crafts is one person, one pot. And then there's everything in between. There are companies like Gruby, where maybe 6 or 7 people were involved in the production of a piece. But it's still considered arts and crafts. So I know it's a long and complicated answer, but it's not.
I guess sometimes it's difficult to have a strict definition for some pieces. So where are the materials being produced? What parts of the United States?
You mean at the time they were produced?
Yeah.
Okay, so part of it has to do with clay deposits. One of the reasons New Jersey had such a great pottery and porcelain business was because of the natural clay deposits in New Jersey. And a potter told me that when the Ice Age pushed the topsoil south, and then the glaciers descended, leaving this topsoil along New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and not coincidentally, you've got the New Jersey companies, you've got Wheeling, West Virginia was a major producer of Staffordshire type ware, more utilitarian ware. The Ohio Valley, which is where Rookwood is from, is one such area. Of course, there's clay deposits all over the country, but some of the biggest producers were in New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania.
Okay. And is there an understanding of how popular this was during the time period? My understanding with the arts and crafts movement is that this is in essence a reaction to an earlier style, in that the Victorian time period where things are a little bit more ostentatious and these pieces have more simple designs to them. How popular was it at that time period?
Well, you're right. It was a reaction against Victorianism, but also against the machine age, the encroachment of the machine on humankind, and for some of the good things it did, like creating a middle class and liberating some folks, it also caused the creation of a lot of really bad mass-produced material. And so the arts and crafts movement wasn't only about getting away from the excesses of the Victorian parlor, but also about getting back to hand craftsmanship, of individuality, of the spirit. Arts and crafts movement is a very lofty movement.
Okay, so against the Industrial Revolution as well.
Yes. Philosophically, it still exists today. The reason we have recess in school and arts and crafts classes in school, not to mention the role it played in women's rights, arts and crafts was really vital in our society.
So tell me about the pieces that you've brought in. You said you have a piece here from Rookwood, which is that Ohio?
This is from Cincinnati, Ohio. Okay. Typical Rookwood piece, photo representational. You can tell a Rookwood piece is pretty because that looks like a crocus on there. And the more it looks like a crocus, the more realistic it is, the more successful it is. It's a rather linear approach to art pottery. They did it as well or better than anybody in the world. They were up against some major players. They won a gold medal at the Paris Exposition in 1900. No small feat for an American company. But if you want something a little more complicated, we look at the work of George Orr, who he couldn't sell a pot while he was alive. He was called the Mad Potter of Biloxi. He's my favorite, Mr. Orr, and these are a couple of extraordinary pieces. This bisque piece is, we used to think the bisque pieces were unfinished, and then we realized that, as he later said, God put no color on souls, so I'll put no color on my pots. And he wanted them to be the purest expression of the potter's art. You can feel him in these things. Can I talk to you about the George Orr relationship to New Jersey?
Sure, yeah.
George Orr died in about 1919 or so, and his sons pushed him out of business in 1907 to turn his pottery into a Cadillac dealership and a motorcycle repair shop. So in about 67, 68, a New Jersey barber from Montague, Jim Carpenter, was looking for car parts, because that's what he did in his spare time. He dealt with used car parts from old autos, and stumbled upon the George Orr hoard. And as fate would have it, there's 10,000 pieces. He lived a half a mile in the country, in the middle of nowhere, to one of the leading historians of the day, Robert Blasberg. So he talked to Blasberg about the Orr pottery, and Blasberg said, oh yeah, this is the real thing. And Carpenter hocked everything he had and drove up all 10,000 pieces to New Jersey in 1970 or 69. It's a little fuzzy as to which date that was. But within an hour of New York City and where the art scene was. By 75, Orr was discovered, and people like Jasper Johns and Andy Warhol started collecting Orr's work, and Johns painted Orr's work in some of his art, and Orr became famous. There's a museum opening in Biloxi, where he's from, this year in October, built by Frank Gehry, showing George Orr's work. So he went from obscurity to world fame.
Wow. So that's I think a good segue into New Jersey. So let's talk about the potters that were in New Jersey. Certainly you mentioned that there were a number of ceramic industries in New Jersey because of the rich clay deposits. And we know in central New Jersey there were bricks, tile, and terracotta factories. In Trenton there were a number of factories there as well. What's New Jersey's role in the art pottery movement?
I think it's a bit of an unfortunate one, actually, because New Jersey got in early. And so 1860s, 1870s, they started producing porcelain because they had these great kaolin deposits in the Trenton area. In fact, behind my house, I'm from that area, there were clay pits we were warned never to go to because they were supposedly bottomless, but that's where the clays were dug locally. And because of the Delaware River, which you needed not just for power, but for access and for delivery of the goods. So Trenton was the Staffordshire of America, as it was called. Back when Trenton Makes the World Takes Bridge had some relevance. Right. So there were many companies, and Ottenbrewer was one of the great early ones. Of course, later became Lennox. Walter Scott Lennox apprenticed with Ottenbrewer. And then there were probably 50 or 75 other different ones producing in Trenton. Till about 1900 or so. Then after 1900, it was more or less just Lennox.
So is there more competition then after 1900 from other firms in other parts of the country? Is that one of the reasons why it dies out, or is the talent not there to produce it? What's the...
I think it dies out because they didn't change with the times. They were very Victorian. I mean, if you look at who worked at the Trenton Potteries, they brought some of the masters from County Cork, Ireland, who were working with Irish Belique, and they brought Isaac Broom over, and some some major players came to Trenton to expand the China trade in the New World. And unfortunately, these people were mired in Victorianism, and as times and tastes changed, Trenton didn't seem to change with them.
Right, okay.
There are some exceptions, but by and large, the Jersey potteries pretty much were played out by the end of the Victorian era.
Okay, well, what about like Gruby in Perth Amboy in Calvin Party's factory? So that's a little bit later. Let's
1917, 1918. I mean, Gruby is a serious arts and crafts pottery, and they had a good run from about 1896 to about 1906. And in 1907, they switched to tile production and continued to produce tiles until 1917, when they were bought by Party and the holdings were brought to New Jersey. Perth Amboy, correct?
Right, yeah.
Yes. Unfortunately, at that point, it's what happens to all good things. Look at Christmas and yoga. They start off with the purest of intentions and they become commercialized.
Okay.
And Gruby just couldn't afford to make hand-produced ware. The glazes they made were still exemplary, and you can see the use of Party tiles with Gruby glazes. And Leland advertised, some of the early ads said that we feature Gruby glazes, but it wasn't Gruby.
Okay.
It had very little to do with Gruby, unfortunately, at that time.
Okay. You have another piece over there as well?
I brought a piece. I wasn't sure if we were talking just about pottery or the nature of collecting. This is a piece of Tiffany. It's bronze with tortoise shell glass in it. Looks like a spaceship. It's really an inkwell.
Oh.
And Tiffany was not far from here, Corona, New York, and they made some they're known for their great lamps, of course, and their blown vases, but they made a lot of different things. Louis Comfort Tiffany's approach to decorative arts, and I brought it because if we're going to talk about the nature of collecting and about the vicissitudes of the market, then Tiffany has been a blue chip stock forever. You may as well have been buying gold if you buy Tiffany.
Well, let's do that then. What should people look for when they're collecting art pottery?
When people want to start collecting art pottery, the first thing I tell them is don't buy anything.
Okay.
Take your time, okay? There's plenty of pottery out there. You may lose a piece by taking your time, but you're much more likely to buy the wrong piece than miss the right one.
Okay.
There's so much information available these days. You can go to an auction, for example. We have an auction coming up in June, and we do them 3 times a year. There'll be 200 or 300 pieces of art pottery, and it's like a museum, but you can actually touch the stuff. There's a lot of books out now. Unlike when I got started in '72, there was virtually nothing available on the movement. Museum collections, the Metropolitan Museum of Art just got a serious donation, one of the great collections on display in the new wing. The Newark Museum, our own Newark Museum, has had great examples of art pottery. They bought them new at the turn of the century. They were very, very ahead of the curve.
Huh. Oh, great. So how about what's the price range then? I mean, is it something that somebody looking to get into it on an introduction level can find it to be affordable? I mean, is there a broad price range for art pottery?
Yes, there is a broad range of pricing for American art pottery. And again, how do we define art pottery? If you wanted to buy a piece of Roseville pottery, which is loosely connected to the art pottery movement, or later on, you can buy pieces for under $100. You're going to get something that's molded and mass-produced, but still of the period, still of the 30s or 40s. On the other end of the spectrum, we sold a piece in one of our auctions for over $500,000.
Really?
A piece by Frederick Reed done in California in about 1915. But that all said, if you want to buy a decent piece, you should expect to spend at least a couple to $3,000.
Right. Okay.
That's sort of your entry-level price for a good piece.
And what's the pieces that you brought in? What value range are we talking about for them?
Well, the least expensive would be this piece of Rookwood, and it's a pretty good example, but still $3,000 to $4,000.
Okay.
Not terribly expensive. They've gone down a little bit and haven't recovered as much in light of the Lehman Brothers crash and the economic travails we're experiencing today. The Ora Bisque vase, when I first went to Jim Carpenter's, which would have been around 1975, that pot was $45 and sat there. Nobody wanted them. They thought they were incomplete. Now that should bring $4,000 to $5,000.
Wow.
The 3-handled loving cup with the great glaze on it and the in-body twist, that's worth about $10,000 to $15,000.
Wow.
The Tiffany inkwell about $3,000 to $4,000.
Okay. Are the pieces generally marked? I mean, is it easy for somebody to sort of pick up a Rookwood vase and determine whether it's actually made from them?
Well, some things are very well marked. Rookwood was a German-run company in a German town, and the bottoms of their pots have the year, the mark, the artist signature, the clay type, the shape number, and the size, if not more information. Or seldom did not mark a pot. I've seen a couple pieces without marks over the years, but extremely rare, and Tiffany pretty much marked everything.
Okay.
So yes, by and large, sometimes it's more likely a mark is obscured, like on a piece of Gruby. The bottom may be covered with glaze, or there may have been a chip at the base, and they ground the base flat to absorb the chip, and doing so remove the marks. But most of the better pottery is not only signed, but artist signed.
Okay. Okay. And how does condition affect the value?
Condition affects the value quite a bit on some things and very little on others.
All right.
For example, people who buy Rookwood are buying perfection. They want something that looks exactly like a flower or an Indian portrait or whatever is supposed to be on it. And so crazing, which naturally occurs on most pieces, this one doesn't have any crazing, and that's a little crackling to the glaze that occurs during the cooling process. They'll mark it down for crazing. Rookwood themselves was so tough that when they made a piece that had a problem with it, they would X the bottom of it. Whereas George Orr, I've sold George Orr for over $100,000 with more than a little repair. Because each piece, his thing was, if you're familiar with the Chinese tea ceremony, it's one meeting, one chance. It's Yo-Jie. And very much with George Orr and the true arts and crafts potters, it's one moment, one pot. And he invested himself in these things. And if you like his expression of that moment, that's the only piece you're going to get that says that. So you take it with some damage, you mark the price down a little bit, but you move on.
Right. So let's say a common item. If this vase here had a chip on it, how much would that reduce the value of it?
A chip that you could see on the top rim or coming up the side from the base, instead of being $3,000 to $4,000, $750 to $1,000.
Really? Okay.
I mean, significant.
So it's, yeah, significant.
Whereas this Orr bisque piece, if it had a chip on the top, instead of $4,000 to $5,000, it would still be $35,000 to $45,000 or $3,000 to $4,000, no less than that.
Okay. Okay. How about, are there fakes in the art pottery field?
It's a good question, and one of the most curious things I've seen, I've been doing this for 40 years now, is that Orr is our most unique potter. I don't like to use the word unique very often, but he was out there on his own little tangent, and yet his work is the most imitated.
Is it? Okay.
And they're faked. There are three ways Orr's work was faked. Early on, as I mentioned, we used to think the bisque pieces were unfinished, so you couldn't sell them. That's why they were $45 a piece. Well, there was a couple people in New Jersey started buying up the bisques and putting glazes on them. And selling them as real Orr pieces. I got stung in 75, 76. I bought a lot of these fakes. And didn't sell Orr for a while because of that. I was pretty upset about it. In the process, they ruined a lot of really great bisque Orr. Okay, so that was the first run of fakes. The second run of fakes are from the ground up, as they say. They would get something fairly simple, a simple cylinder shape that they molded around an upside down glass, and then twisted it or ruffled it and put a black glaze on it. And his marks could be a die stamp, so they would get printer stamps and impress G.E. Orr Biloxi into the wet clay. And those had a lifespan until people figured out what they look like. And then finally, some people just get these ridiculous things like a pottery tree trunk with bark and stuff, and cover the bottom with a white epoxy and scratch Orr into it, and then put shoe polish on it. As crazy as it sounds, I've seen people buy that stuff.
Really? So in your experience, you would be able to spot a fake very easily then?
Yes, I can, primarily because I bought them as real early on and learned the hard way. As a friend of mine once said, if you want to know what not to do in the auction business, talk to Dave, because he's made every mistake there is.
How about, instead of fakes, how about period imitations? Were other factories trying to mimic popular designs? And how would that affect the value if it's an imitation?
Absolutely, and in fact, there's so much of that.
Yeah.
Rookwood, for example, defined slip-decorated, underglaze pottery, and that's what this is, basically. They were so popular that Roseville, Weller, Owens, Cambridge, Rexton, McCoy, there were probably 15 companies that were trying to capitalize on Rookwood's fame. With Orr didn't have any people, he couldn't sell what he was making. Nobody wanted to copy what he was doing. But Gruby, who we mentioned earlier, there are over 100 companies that had a matte green glaze. And Gruby, which I don't have an example here, but Gruby, captures the essence of what the arts and crafts was in America. Can I talk about that and then answer your question? Okay, so what do I mean when I say that? Well, the Europeans believed it was really one person, one pot. The Americans industrialized it a little bit to make it more available to the everyday person. The British approach, William Morris and such, it was still for people with money. By the time it got here, it was democratized. And you see Gustav Stickley did that in his arts and crafts furniture, and Gruby certainly did that because instead of having the expense of one person working on one piece from start to finish, they probably were able to produce the pieces for a quarter of the price by having that small production line. So somebody at Gruby would get a piece of mud and spin it on a wheel and raise it into a pot form. That's raising the lowest, which is mud, into a piece of art. And then they would have this design that mimicked that upward flow of life energy by having leaves and buds and things growing up the side of the pot. And then they would cover it with these organic dead mat glazes, mimicking garden variety vegetables. Primarily cucumber would be the most typical Gruby color. Now, unlike a piece of rookwood, where if you touch it, you leave your fingerprints on it, a piece of Gruby wants you to hold it because there's this energy to this thing, and it's supposed to bring you back in touch with a reality that was fast leaving because of the Industrial Revolution. And that's what arts and crafts was. It was not just bringing you back into the creative process by having you do it yourself, but if you couldn't, then surround yourself with objects that contain that spirit.
What's the, how is the market for art pottery?
Well, there are probably 50 makers that matter. There were probably 200 companies that operated, and some were so short-lived and such small production we won't really count them. But there are maybe 50 that matter, and as you might, just like with any stock portfolio, not all. If you buy 50 stocks, they're not all going to do the same. By and large, the best material never lost value. Okay, and that's true in all markets. The rather ordinary pieces, they're having a hard time finding where they are these days. George has pretty much held his value, maybe dropped off about 10%. Rookwood took a real hit in 2009. Prices dropped 30–40%, and they've worked their way back up since then. Okay.
So all the years that you've been dealing in art pottery, have you noticed fluctuations? I mean, does the market go up and down?
It does, but it's been mostly an upward graph. For example, Newcomb College pottery, another great arts and crafts pottery from Tulane University, which was started to help women who they couldn't get married. The men were wiped out during the Civil War, and so all these widows didn't have anything to do. And it was as simple as it sounds, decorating china, decorating pottery, and what kind of future is that? It set the stage for Rosie the Riveter a couple generations later. Newcomb had that upward trajectory. Every year, Newcomb went up 5 to 10%, leveled, 20% leveled, 15%, and it took a dive in about 2008, 2009. So there are companies that counterintuitively have really lost value. For the most part, pottery has held its own.
Now, is there, let's see, how about the age of people who are collecting? Is there a generational difference between people that are collecting these? Do you notice young people going to the auctions and collecting art pottery, or is it a certain age range?
It's a very good question. What I would say is the demographic for people collecting arts and crafts has definitely gotten up there. I say the average buyer is over 50, okay? But not everybody who buys George and Gruby is an arts and crafts collector. Okay, some people fit out their home with Gustav Stickley furniture and a nice drugget rug and a period Dirk Van Erp lamp, a hammered copper lamp. All these things work synergistically together. Of course, it's like a basic black dress. You need a good piece of jewelry, and a piece of Gruby on that mantle is the right accoutrement for an arts and crafts interior. But there are people who collect only Gruby, and there are people who collect only New England decorative ceramics. And so you have these different collecting niches that keep driving it. Again, a long answer to your question, but I'd say the arts and crafts person buying art pottery is getting up there in years. They pretty much have what they want already, and so they're not adding much to their collections. Whereas I would say younger buyers are probably attracted more to George Orr.
Okay.
He's much more current looking.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine that piece is, what, 100 years old?
This piece is probably 1905, and the red handle piece probably about 1900. So tell me about yourself. How long have you been, or what got you interested in art pottery? Well, if you're born middle class in the Trenton area, then your house had to have a Lennox shrine in it, and we had our little Lennox shrine. That was the stuff you better not break. My father was an artist. He worked for I worked for RCA as a draftsman in the Astro division, so he was always painting in the cellar. So we had an interest in arts, and my parents would take us to local flea markets, Englishtown, Lambertville, on weekends, regularly, not every weekend, but often, and so I liked them. And I started selling at a flea market in '72 at Lambertville, at the Golden Nugget. And,
which is still there, right?
It's still there, right? Still pass it regularly. But I was selling junk at the time. I wasn't really an antique dealer, and I made more money working for myself at my table at the flea market than I did at Bernie's bicycle shop in Mercerville. And Bernie was a difficult guy to work for in any case. So I said, this is cool. I get to be my own boss. And then the second week I went back there and did very little business because I had no new inventory. So I started doing yard sales and such, and stumbled on Lenox China. In Trenton at a flea market, and started buying stock for my booth, and it all sprung from there.
Wow. Now, in 1996, you opened the Rago Auction and Art Center in Lambertville.
We moved our auctions from New York City to Lambertville in '96. That's right. We've been holding auctions since '84. Our first three were at the Meadowlands Hilton up in North Jersey, and then we started holding them in New York City. And finally got to move them to Lambertville. We were convinced that our clientele wouldn't follow us out of New York. And the irony is our crowd existed, or tripled, I would say.
Really?
The crowd, as it existed, tripled in 1 year because most people didn't want to go to New York City.
Yeah. And Lambertville seems to have its active art scene as well there, in New Hope as well.
Absolutely. It was a most fortuitous move in many ways. Aside from that art scene, it is an artist colony, had been for a century at that point. In addition to that, we got into the modern business as well, and the New Hope School, George Nakashima, Phil Powell, Paul Evans, Noguchi, a lot of people work there, and so the material was in the houses, and we became geographically blessed. It was dumb luck, I assure you.
You're also a regular on the Antiques Roadshow. Can you talk a little bit about your involvement with that?
Sure. I've been doing it since its inception 16 years ago. I got this phone call in, I guess it was '95, by this man Dan Farrell. He's the guy that brought Roadshow to America. He brought the American rights. And
so it's originally a British show.
That's right, and it's still going on there. And he said, "Do you want to do this show?" And I said, "Well, tell me about it." So I spent about 10 minutes listening to the pitch, and I said, "So let me get this straight. You don't pay us. We got to cover our own expenses. There's no guarantee we're going to tape, and there's no guarantee you're going to use the tape if we do tape. Is that right?" He said, "Yeah, that's about it." I said, "I'm not interested." But a good friend of mine, best man at our wedding, lived in Kansas City, and as luck would have it, one of the first locations was Kansas City. So I said, "Well, I'll do that one." Okay, at least I get to hang out with Dan and get some barbecue. So we go to Kansas City, and my wife and I, like that, within half a minute, we walked onto the set, and we said, "These people are serious. This is really going to be good." Because we're not used to that level of production in the antique business. It's really a lot of fly-by-night. It's a business for misfits, by and large. So they liked us enough to invite us back the second year, and by the fourth year, we were both doing all the shows.
Yeah, great. So can you talk about what are been some of the most interesting finds for being on the show?
In terms of interesting finds on the show, I find often occasionally pieces brought in by a person whose family made it. So when the guy whose father owned Union Porcelain Works walked in with two pieces of UPW, they were okay. I'd seen them before, but this guy was there. His dad made this stuff. So that, for me, has been the most interesting. A lot of the stories we hear are not relevant. Some of them are just wrong. As one of our fellow appraisers said, "I'm sorry, there was not Bakelite on the Mayflower." It's a true story, by the way. I once had a person argue with me last year about the dating of a piece because it came by Conestoga wagon to California, and I said, "Well, it's dated 1900. That's really hard to match that." So the stories are not always relevant, but occasionally, for me, those are the best parts of it. I've learned a lot about porcelain for sure. I'm primarily a ceramics guy, art pottery, but I've gotten to see some of the best porcelain in the world over the years. I mean, who knew what 18th century Meissen looked like? I didn't have a clue.
Well, David, thank you for bringing in these pieces and talking to us about art pottery, the history of it, New Jersey's connection, and collecting it as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me here.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode as we discussed art pottery with David Rago. For more information, you can visit Mr. Rago's website at ragoarts.com. And for comments or suggestions about today's episode, you can visit the East Brunswick Public Library website at ebpl.org. Thank you for watching, and come along again as we travel on the History Trail.